Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for being here today. In today's video, I am going to be covering the new fusion event. This is the Panda fusion event. This is the Bambus Fourleaf fusion event. So as you can see, it is a traditional fusion, meaning we have other fusion champions we have to collect in order to complete the event for Bambus Fourleaf. We are getting 4 new rares. We've gotten 2 new epics. So I'm going to cover all 7 champions in this video to talk about the relative strengths and weaknesses of those, so you can decide whether or not you want to go for the legendary, or maybe you could be satisfied with 1 or 2 of the epics, or even some of the rares, depending on where your account is, what your resources look like, and what you need for your roster. Then at the end, we will take a look at the event schedule and sketch out a basic plan for anybody who does intend to go for the legendary fusion. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so let's get started. Okay, here he is, Bambus Fourleaf. He is a legendary support in the Skinwalkers faction. Let's start with his stats. If we take a look, he has a decent HP pool, decent defense, very nice speed at 110. Even has some built-in accuracy in his kit with 20 accuracy, which is a nice little bonus. These stats don't jump out at me as particularly strong or weak. I think the best stat probably here is the speed at 110, plus that bonus little accuracy is going to make it easier to get to the accuracy numbers you need to land any debuffs. But from a stat perspective, solid but not overwhelming, and certainly not weak. Okay, before we get started looking at the actual kit, I want to just show you that there's this weird mechanic that happens on all of these skills. This places a sleep debuff on this champion for 1 turn. This debuff cannot be blocked or resisted. So after every skill use, doesn't matter which skill it is, Bambus Fourleaf puts himself to sleep. His passive then revolves around how he wakes up from this sleep and having extra effects. So there's another champion in the game called Canelia. She's in the Dwarven faction. She has a similar mechanic, but I'm assuming this is because pandas sleep a lot. And so this is sort of a funny way to, work that into the kit. Now, the passive will play in some cases, but I think we're actually going to consider this champion without the sleep mechanic at first. So if we want to judge whether or not we want to actually go for this fusion, we have to look at the rest of the kit, because I do think that this extra mechanic, this passive sleep mechanic, is going to be a bit tricky to use for a lot of players. And so we want to see, without that mechanic, is the champion still good? All right, with that being said, let's take a look at his A1. Now this attacks 1 enemy and has a 65% chance when booked of placing the large decrease speed debuff for 2 turns. That's pretty solid all on its own. If we compare that to Syl of the Drakes, another legendary support, she has a 40% chance of placing a decreased speed on her A1. She also gets a little bit of turn meter decrease on that ability. So the trade-off there is 40% for the decreased speed, but the turn meter versus 75% chance here for the decreased speed. Now 75% chance is very high, so I think this is a pretty good trade. In addition, there's this second mechanic which will turn this attack into an AoE if the initial target is under 2 or more debuffs. So it's a conditional AoE, but having an AoE slow on an A1 is very strong. This does reduce the chance of placing that slow by 10%, but a 65% chance on an AoE for a slow is actually still very strong as well. If you look at White Dryad Naya, I believe she has an AoE slow on her A1, and the chance is somewhere around 50%. So 65% is a nice high percentage. So without the extra mechanic, this skill alone feels like a legendary A1. And yeah, so we're starting off in a good spot. Okay, now the A2 is also an AoE. It's not conditional this time, but before attacking, this places a shield buff on all allies equal to 30% of their max HP. Not Bambus Fourleaf's max HP, but their own HP. This also increases the duration of all buffs on all allies by 1 turn. Now I'm going to stop right here because I think this alone makes this a pretty good skill. It is on a 4-turn cooldown, but I think the way that this is going to work, and I'm not 100% sure, so we'll have to see it in action, but I think the way that this is going to work is that before attacking, the shield will go up on all the allies. And then the duration of all the buffs on all allies will be increased by 1. including the duration of this shield. So what we should get is a shield with a 3-turn duration on a 4-turn cooldown. 75% uptime is very good. So from the standpoint of just the first part of this skill, I think it's relatively strong. We're getting more and more of these duration increase champions, which is great because I think that adds flexibility to the entire game. You can build team compositions, say for clan boss, that are not based primarily on unkillable mechanics. So this increased duration of all buffs on all allies is a really nice ability. Now, the second part of this ability, after attacking, has a 100% chance of decreasing the duration of all enemy buffs by 1 turn. Also nice. Even if the attack lands as a weak hit. Extra bonus. Sweet. This also increases the value of any shield buffs on all allies by 2% for each enemy buff that had its duration decreased by this skill. This particular line, the shield increase, I think is going to be very tricky to pull off when you would want to actually do it. So typically you want to build shields for only a couple of reasons. If you're just doing it for survivability's sake, then having buffs up on your enemies is generally bad. So for instance, if you took this champion into Hydra, you would have to deliberately let the Hydra heads all get their buffs and then reduce their duration by 1, which by the way isn't enough because the durations will always be 2. And so you are trading a slightly larger shield for 1 extra turn of all of the enemies having their buffs up, which seems like a bad trade. So I'm not sure how this second part will play out. It might be a little bit more effective, say, in Arena, but we'll have to see. Now, on the A3, this is not a hit. This is very important to know, but it does target an enemy. Now, first, it places an increased attack buff. I'm sorry. First, it places an increased accuracy buff and an increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. So these are both great buffs, especially when you're trying to land additional debuffs. So this increases Bamboo's accuracy before he tries to land a debuff. Now, he will try to land a debuff with this skill, which is an Enfeeble. It has a 100% chance of placing an Enfeeble debuff on the target for 2 turns. If you don't know, an Enfeeble is a relatively new debuff, and what the effect is that anybody under an Enfeeble debuff will always weak hit on every ability, basically negating any chance of landing any debuffs and also reducing their overall damage. Now, the Enfeeble debuff cannot be placed on bosses. If it's a boss, it would switch to a 100% chance to a decreased accuracy debuff on all enemies for 2 turns. I think this is really interesting. This is the first champion that has an Enfeeble debuff, but I expect that this will play primarily in the arena and maybe in some high level Doom Tower waves. There might be some champions you might want to land an Enfeeble on. I'm thinking of the waves that have Mortu Macabre, for instance. If you can Enfeeble a Mortu Macabre, all of a sudden, he's a lot less tricky to get past. I do think this is an interesting skill, but again, another tricky one to use and not valuable everywhere. Finally, the aura increases ally HP in all battles by 25%, which is a fine aura, but not overwhelming in any way. So now let's go ahead and look at this strange passive. So the passive has 2 effects. The passive effect of the passive is that it has a 50% chance of transferring any debuffs placed on on an ally to this champion while they are under a sleep debuff. So if he is asleep and debuffs are placed on your allies, he has a 50% chance of pulling them to himself. He will not transfer any CCs to himself. It's interesting. It doesn't say anything about sleep, so potentially he could transfer sleeps to himself. But he already has sleep, and he likes sleep. So that's interesting. But anyway, so this is a potential sort of, it's somewhere between a cleanse and a block debuffs sort of mechanic. And then at the start of this champion's turn, he will remove any sleep debuffs from himself. So if he has his sleep debuff up from his effects, from his skills, then he will wake himself up. The active effect of this is this transfers all debuffs from this champion to the enemy with the highest resistance if a sleep debuff was removed from this champion by this champion's passive skill. So obviously you can remove a sleep debuff from an enemy by hitting them. So if he gets hit and wakes up because he got hit, I don't think this counts as activating the passive effect. The passive effect has to be that he gets to his turn, and then during his turn, he wakes up. and then he would transfer all debuffs from this champion to the enemy with the highest resistance. Now, this effect cannot be resisted, which means it doesn't require accuracy. So that's really nice, dropping all those debuffs on a champion that you normally couldn't drop a bunch of debuffs on because it has such high resistance. However, I think this is going to be a very tricky passive to use because I think in general, getting him to wake up just naturally without ever being hit is going to be unlikely. Any AoEs will take his sleep off, and then obviously he may be targeted as well. Sometimes the AI won't target enemies that are asleep because they don't want to wake them up. But again, like I said, any AoEs would wake this up. And certainly in arena, like if you were on arena defense with this guy, the enemy would just go ahead and target him and make sure that he never gets this passive to work. So where is Bambus Fourleaf going to be used? Well, I think it's really interesting because I think he's going to be used in different places by different players at different areas of account progression. So if you are in the early game or mid game, I do think that this is a decent champion to go for, if for no other reason than this decreased speed AoE has a really high percentage, and that's an incredibly valuable skill. But you also have the shield buff and the increased duration of all ally buffs. So just those two abilities alone, I think, make him worthwhile as a progression champion. Once he gets towards endgame, I think these are going to be less valuable skills, and the more valuable skills are going to be this enfeeble for the arena, and then also this passive. Once we sort of as a community figure out exactly how to use this, I think there are going to be some interesting solutions that are built around this passive for maybe some high level Doom Tower, or maybe some Hydra boss, or maybe some high level arena. So I do think that players at all levels of progression may want this champion, but they're going to use him for different purposes at different places. In terms of his overall value, I would say it's solid. I don't think this is an overwhelmingly strong champion. I don't think he's so valuable to a mid-game account that you absolutely can't skip this champion. So if you have to stretch to get this champion and you have a chance of failing because you are close to your limit on resources, or you know you won't be able to focus enough playing time in the game to make sure that you complete this fusion, I would say go ahead and pass on that. You should be comfortable with that decision. If you've got a lot of resources sitting at hand and you just like doing fusions, or you can envision a good end game reason for this champion, or if you are a mid-game player who has a lot of extra resources sitting around, maybe you are a spender, then you could certainly go after Bambus Fourleaf. Now, I will be going after Bambus Fourleaf probably on my main account. I'm not 100% sure of that yet. I've done 3 fusions in a row, and I think all of those 3 fusions are better than Bambus Fourleaf. But as an endgame player, giving up on this champion feels potentially tricky. Like somebody might figure out a really cool use for this guy, and then I wouldn't have him. So since I have the resources, I will probably make a play for this fusion. However, on my early game account, I am not going to be going for this fusion. I'm going to be focusing on some of the lesser fusion champions. So there are 2 epics and 4 rares that we need to consider. So if you are a newer player, sometimes fusions, traditional fusions like this can be really valuable, not because you can actually complete the entire fusion, but because you might get a very powerful epic or even a few really good rares that can help out your account. So now let's go take a look at those champions. Okay, so staying here in the Skinwalkers faction, we have the rare Meat Carver Tolog. He is an HP based champion. Looking at his stats are solid, over 20k HP, defense is almost 1k, speed of 95, resistance of 40, which is a little bit high. That's actually kind of nice. So let's go ahead and take a look at his kit. The A1 hits 2 times. It heals this champion by 2% of their max HP with a decent HP pool. That's not going to be too bad. The A2 places a lesser increased defense on all allies for 2 turns and a continuous heal buff on all allies for 1 turn on a 4-turn cooldown. This is a nice bit of survivability and certainly could be useful in faction crypts. But if you are in the mid game, you probably already have a better champion for sort of survivability against wave content, which is what this ability is for. So again, okay, but not super strong. Here's the A3, which revives an ally with 30% HP and 30% turn meter, plus places a continuous heal buff on that revived ally for 1 turn. This is on a 4-turn cooldown. So I think the combination of these skills makes this champion a very good faction crypt champion. So if you are looking for a reviver in the Skinwalkers faction, if you are looking for somebody who can create some more survivability for your team in wave content, I think that this champion is viable. I do think if you look at the rares here in the Skinwalker faction, they needed an additional rare. They could still use a few rares, and they need some extra help here. This is the first rare that is actually a reliable reviver. And in fact, there's only one other reliable reviver in the epic rarity, and that is Hofaries here. So if you are looking for help in the faction crypt here, I do think Tolog can be extremely valuable, even for a late game player who maybe doesn't have a reliable reviver in this faction. Okay, now here in the Knights Revenant faction, we have the second champion, Longsword Torix. I think Torix looks like a rare, doesn't he? He looks exactly like a rare. He looks kind of cool, but not cool enough to be an epic, right? So yeah, kind of an interesting look here. Definitely fits the Knights Revenant faction to a T. So again, looking at the stats, decent stats. HP pool is a little bit lower than the last champion we looked at, with similar defense, a little bit less speed, but again, 40 resist, which is nice. This one is a defensive-based champion. Looking at the A1, this has a 45% chance of placing a leech debuff for 2 turns. This is a pretty high chance for an A1 leech. So yeah, this is not a bad skill at all. There are several epics who have leeches on their A1 right around 40% or 35%. So this is actually a little bit higher than those. Now the A2 is an AoE. Before attacking, places an increased defense buff on all allies for 2 turns. Remember, that will increase his damage. This is the lesser increased defense, but he's a defense-based champion, so he's doing more damage because of this increased defense. This also has what looks like a 65% chance of placing a provoke on an AoE. That's a very good ability on a 3-turn cooldown. This skill does take a lot of books, but they're rare books. So far, I'm liking this champion's kit. The final ability is a passive. So the active effect places a block damage buff on this champion for 1 turn if the incoming damage exceeds 20% of this champion's max HP. That's fairly strong. He also counterattacks when hit by an enemy under a provoke debuff. Now this does have a cooldown. It has a 4-turn cooldown. So I don't know if the passive counterattack is on a 4-turn cooldown. My suspicion is that the block damage buff is on a 4-turn cooldown, but the counterattack would happen every single time he's attacked. So this is really nice synergy in this kit. You have the leech, which helps with bosses. You have the increased defense, which helps with everybody. You have the provoke, which helps with wave content. And then you have the passive, which with the block damage, which again helps in all content, and the counterattack, which is really nice for that wave content. You can even look at the aura here, which increases allied defense in dungeons by 25%. I would prefer this to actually be faction crypts here, because I think he's a faction crypt champion. But you could bring him into some dungeons. He certainly could do some work for you in the waves before you get to the bosses. You could actually also potentially consider him a spiderling tank. So he is Spirit Affinity, which means at stage 10, and I think it might be 25, he's going to be weak affinity. He has a built-in increased defense, he has a built-in provoke, and he has a built-in leech. So might be worth it as a spiderling tank. That would be interesting to see if he can do that job. So all in all, I actually think that Longsword Torix is a decent champion. If you need an increased defense champion, remember it is the lesser version, or if you need some wave control, that provoke can be very helpful in Doom Tower or in dungeons, especially with that dungeon aura. Okay, the third champion here is a rare in the Demon Spawn faction, Petrifia Rockroot. I guess based around petrifying, you know, she's turning into rock. Okay, cool. Now, again, I'm happy that they're adding more rares to the game. I think it's been a while since we've added any significant number of rares. You know, obviously there's been a focus on the Sylvan Watchers faction because that's the newest faction, so we've been getting rares there. But rares in other factions could be very helpful and, you know, provide not only additional faction wars champions, but maybe some additional utility for early and mid-game accounts. Now, looking at the stats here for Petrifia, we have kind of low HP, fairly low defense, decent attack number, decent speed, some accuracy in the kit. So she is an attack-based champion, so she's probably more of a damage dealer. Definitely going to be tricky to keep alive with these stats, so that is something to watch out for. You would think that somebody who was named Petrifia Rockroot would be tougher. You know, I don't know why she's an attack-based champion and not a defense-based champion, but there we go. Okay, the A1 is a 2-hitter. Each hit has looks like 35% chance of placing a decreased defense debuff for 2 turns. It is the lesser decreased defense, but if the target is under a poison sensitivity, then the debuff is changed to the larger decreased defense instead. So a 35% chance on a 2-hitter is pretty good. That means you're going to have about 60% uptime on this decreased defense. So not a bad ability against bosses. The A2 is an AoE. It is on a 3-turn cooldown, and it has a 100% chance of placing a decreased attack. It is the lesser decreased attack. And then the second hit has a 75% chance of placing 5% poison debuff for 2 turns, again on a 3-turn cooldown. Now, this poison doesn't seem like a lot, but any poisons can be helpful against bosses. We already have the decreased defense against bosses, and now we have decreased attack, which is good against bosses. So this is shaping up as a potential clan boss champion, or maybe a dungeon boss champion, maybe even in specific cases a Doom Tower boss champion. The A3 is a triple hitter. Each hit looks like a 40% chance of placing a 25% poison sensitivity debuff for 2 turns. So 3 hits at 40% chance means more than 75% uptime on the poison sensitivity. If all hits land on the same target, this also places a poison debuff for 2 turns. Now, this sounds like it's just 1 poison debuff, so it's not 3 poison debuffs because it's 3 hits. I think all you have to do is say, if all 3 hits land on the same target, which would be like the clan boss, would only be the 1 target in the fight, so it would have to land all 3 hits on the clan boss. Then you get an additional poison, and this is at 100% chance. If all hits land on the same target, places a poison. So I'm not sure about the weak hits here. This is a little bit strange. Maybe, typically if you have a chance to land a poison, then if you weak hit, you can't land that because that's how that mechanic works. But this says places a poison and there's no percent chance, which usually implies that it's affinity friendly. So this may be that as long as you are attacking the clan boss, the poison will always land. This is on a 4-turn cooldown. The poison is up for 2 turns, as is the poison sensitivity. So by herself, I don't think she brings a lot of extra damage to the clan boss, but she brings poison sensitivity and some additional poisons, so she might work really well with an additional poisoner. So if you have Kale as your starter champion, getting that poison sensitivity debuff on the boss will increase your overall damage. In addition, she has some good clan boss abilities, this decreased defense, and the decreased attack is going to extend your lifespan. So she looks like a decent clan boss champion, but again, she's squishy, so maybe not. I did think about one potential combination with her is that she could be paired well with Frozen Banshee. Frozen Banshee lands her poisons on her A1 only if a poison sensitivity is up, but you don't have that poison sensitivity up 100% of the time. So if you combine Petrifia with Frozen Banshee, you're going to have that poison sensitivity up pretty close to 100% of the time. You get some additional poisons here. You get that decreased defense. You get that decreased attack. And then Frozen Banshee is going to land all of her poisons all of the time. Okay, now the last rare is actually a Void rare, Selenia Nightcloak from the High Elves faction. She's kind of cool looking. I like her. Definitely for a Void rare, she's got a little bit of extra flair going on. So that's cool. Now, if we look at her stats, her HP pool is pretty low. Attack is nice at 1266. Defense is a little bit low. Speed at 100 is solid. A little bit of extra crit damage there at the 57% instead of the 50%. So stat-wise, okay. Not overly impressive, but nice speed, nice attack. Looking at her A1, this is a single hit against a single target, but it heals this champion by 10% of their max HP. That's a nice chunky heal. Think about the fact that Scylla the Drake's passive is also for 10%. So obviously that's an AoE, but she is the support. This is an attack-based champion who has some pretty decent sustain on their A1. In addition, this changes to a 20% max HP heal if the target is under an HP burn debuff. Now that would be a nice chunky heal. Also imagine, like, if you had lifesteal on her, you'd be getting all of that damage healing, or the healing based on the damage for the lifesteal set, and then you've also got this 20% 8% max HP on top of that. So she could have a ton of sustain, or you could even sustain her without a lifesteal set. For instance, if you just had a leech out there, a leech and this max HP heal could be very powerful. On the A2, we have an AoE on a 3-turn cooldown that has a 65% chance of increasing the duration of any HP burn debuffs by 1 turn. Now, HP burn extension is a very valuable skill because we have so many HP burn activators in the game now. We have Artak, who just was a free champion a few months ago, and he has not only an AoE HP burn and an activation, he also has an extension on his A1. But I think that's like a 35% chance or a 40% chance when booked. So this is actually significantly higher than Artak's HP burn extension. So you could pair her with Artak or another AoE HP burner like Sissia Flame Tongue or maybe Demesia or somebody who puts out an AoE HP burn, extend those HP burns, and then any champions who are either activating them or getting passives based on the HP burns being out there or anything like that are going to be more powerful in conjunction with Selenia. On the A3, she does in fact place some of her own HP burns. This is a 3-time random hitter, but before attacking, she places a small increase accuracy on herself, which means she's going to be more likely to land her HP burns. And then each hit has a 65% chance when booked of placing an HP burn debuff for 2 turns. Now this skill will be decent in wave content because you do have a chance to land up to 3 HP burns, but it's not going to be incredibly powerful for, say, something like Spider Boss. However, against single target bosses, this is pretty solid for landing an HP burn if you don't have another HP burn champion. If each hit is got a 65% chance of landing, your chance of missing is somewhere around 4%. So you're going to be more than 95% uptime. Success chance with this skill. Now this is on a 4-turn cooldown. The HP burns are only up for 2 turns, but remember that you can extend those HP burns with this A2. So 75% uptime is pretty solid. In addition, with that increased accuracy, she's going to land it more often. And remember, she is Void Affinity, so you don't have to worry about weak hits. Finally, her passive boosts this champion's turn meter by 5% each time an HP burn debuff is activated. Now, I'm not sure if activated means it has to be activated by a skill or if it can just tick. So anytime an HP burn debuff ticks normally by an enemy getting their turn. My suspicion is that it's the latter, that just anytime an HP burn goes off, whether it is activated by a champion skill or just ticks based on the natural progression of turns, she's going to get turn meter boost, which potentially means she could get a lot of turn meter boost in big fights like in Doom Tower Waves where you have 5 enemies, or in Spider Boss where you have 11 enemies potentially. Now, she's not going to be able to bring all those HP burns by herself, but this is more evidence that she should be paired up with another AoE HP burner. So I'm actually fairly impressed with this champion. I think she's got a really nice kit. The synergy within the kit is pretty high, and she's going to pair up really well with Artak, who a lot of players have because he was that free login champion. But again, if you have another AoE HP burner, this champion will pair really well with that champion in places like Doom Tower or in places like Spider Boss. So all in all, if we look at the group of rares here from this fusion event, I'm fairly impressed. I think these are 4 above average rares that have been added to the game. And I think a lot of these rares are going to have utility for early and mid game champions. I don't see any of them that are completely worthless. I do think the best of the lot is the Void rare Selenia. But I do think all of the champions could potentially help you out if you are in need of their particular services on your roster. Consider these rare champions, and they shouldn't be too hard to get. You can potentially get 2 or 3, 4, 5, 10 copies of these. What I find is on a mid-game account for me, I can typically pick up somewhere between 6 and 10 rares during a classic fusion, which is going to allow me to get usually 1 or 2 epics and then have 1 or 2 rares left over. But now let's go ahead and look at those epics so you can decide whether or not you want to stick with the rares or upgrade to the epics. Okay, so the first epic is Pan the Bowhorn in the Sylvan Watchers faction. Looking at his stats, he's got a pretty high attack value. The speed at 100 is pretty good. Resistance, accuracy, HP's low, defense isn't too bad. So decent stats. Definitely that attack number stands out as probably the best part of the stat distribution. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the skills. Okay, the A1 attacks 2 times and has a 50% chance of placing a freeze debuff for 1 turn on each hit. So that's a 75% chance that you're going to land it. Will ignore 50% of the target's resistance if the target's speed is equal to or less than this champion's speed. That's really nice. Ignoring 50% resistance is a lot. So that's going to make it easier to build this champion in terms of accuracy requirements. It's almost always the case where your champions are going faster than the enemy in PvE. I'm not sure how this would play in PvP. We'll have to see the rest of the kit. The A2 is an AoE. Before placing, places an increased attack buff and an increased speed buff on this champion for 3 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. Okay, so this synergizes pretty well with the A1 and the kit in general. So it's an AoE, which is nice, but this champion gets an increased attack buff, and he's an attack-based champion with a high base attack. So if his multipliers are any good, this could be a pretty hard-hitting skill. In addition, he gets the increased speed buff before he goes. Now remember, on his A1, he was going to ignore resistance if his speed is higher than his target's. So even if he's a little bit slower without the speed boost, the increased speed buff, once he gets the buff, he's definitely going to be faster than the enemy. And now the A3 is a triple hitter. Each hit will ignore 10% of the target's defense. That's solid. Any ignored defense is good. Each hit also has a 100% chance when booked of placing a True Fear debuff for 2 turns. Okay, you can't place True Fear on bosses. That feels strange on a single target ability, but I guess maybe that could play in Arena. Will ignore 50% of the target's resistance if the speed is equal to, so that's good. So you could potentially land a True Fear on a high resistance target more easily. So that does feel like an Arena ability there. Now, if the target is a boss, has a 100% chance of placing the large weaken debuff for 2 turns instead. So instead of placing the True Fear, places the weaken instead for bosses. That's great. And this will ignore 50% of the target's resistance if this target's speed is equal to or less than this champion's speed. So again, either you're already faster than the boss, or that A2 gives you additional speed, and then you're faster than the boss. So this is a 100% chance weaken on a 3-hitter that's already ignoring 10% of the target's defense. So again, if the multipliers on this champion are any good, with that high attack number, that solid base speed to work off of, you've got a decent debuff here. You would need accuracy to land that debuff, but again, with the ignore resistance, the accuracy requirements will be reduced. So it seems pretty solid. And then we've got ally speed in dungeons by 20%. So this feels like a Fire Knight champion. 2-hitter on the A1, 3-hitter on the A3. You have a weaken. You have a freeze, which could be used in hard mode for Fire Knight. And then you also have an AoE with an increased attack, which is going to help you get through the waves. So this feels like a really friendly, nice early game solution or mid-game solution for getting into Fire Knight. Now, it does feel more suited to actually, I said earlier mid-game, but it actually feels more suited to hard mode Fire Knight because there's no turn meter decrease here, and there's no slow here. But that freeze is what you need for Fire Knight hard mode. So interesting champion. I don't know that I would necessarily prioritize him over the rares that we've seen. But certainly if you have all the jobs that those rares provide covered, then Panda the Bowhorn seems solid. I would say, he's not an S tier epic, but he might be like a solid B+ or A- kind of epic. We'll have to see what his multipliers look like. Okay, the last champion here in the fusion is Malkith Bloodflock. You can see he's got a bird motif going on with Knight's Revenant. Very cool looking. Yeah, I like his look. I think that's a nice addition to the Knight's Revenant. Very cool. I like his staff. Looks mean. Got tattoos. Very cool. Okay, so let's take a look at his stat pool. HP is a bit better than the previous champions. Attack is lower. Defense is a little bit higher. This is a support-based champion. So as far as supports are concerned, this is a decent defense number at 1.1k. A little bit low on the HP at 16.5. I'd like to see something like 18k would be better. Speed is good at 99. Accuracy and resistance are solid. So stats are okay here. Nothing crazy impressive. Nothing particularly, scary. I don't have to worry too much about him being super squishy. So he should be survivable enough to play his role. So let's take a look at the A1. This attacks one enemy one time and has a 70% chance of stealing one random buff from the target. Damage is based on attack. 70% chance of stealing a buff on an A1 feels pretty good, but obviously that requires accuracy. Now he comes into the game with 15 accuracy, which is going to give you a little bit of a leg up. So not a bad A1. It feels okay. A2 is an AoE on a 3-turn cooldown, and it has a 100% chance of decreasing the duration of all enemy buffs by 1 turn, and then increasing the duration of all ally buffs by 1 turn. But this is interesting because the A1 steals buffs, and then the A2 reduces the duration of enemy buffs. So he's not a buff strip champion, but he does actually kind of act that way, right? He doesn't just straight up remove them, but he has 2 mechanics at least for affecting enemy buffs. Now his A3 is a revive, revives 2 random allies with 30% HP and 30% turn meter, places a shield buff on all revived allies for 2 turns equal to 30% of this champion's max HP, which will be a decent shield, not huge, but he's got an okay HP pool. It's a little bit low. We've got a reviver here on a 4-turn cooldown. And then the aura is ally accuracy and faction crypts by 50, which would help him steal buffs and stuff. Now that's actually kind of interesting because this makes me think that the A1 is primarily used for stealing buffs against bosses, right? For taking those buffs off bosses in faction crypts, maybe even taking buffs off bosses in Doom Tower. Potion keeps, clan boss even. And this is, I think this is the second champion we have that decreases the duration of all enemy buffs, right? Because Bambus himself also does something like this. In fact, I think he has this exact skill, but it's more powerful. So that's kind of interesting to see that, thematic line continued into the epic champion that goes into the fusion. Now, I don't think that this champion feels overpowered, but this also feels like a useful champion, especially if you don't have an increased duration champion. So if you want the increased duration of ally buffs and you can't go for the legendary, this gives you another nice option for getting that. It is on a 3-turn cooldown, which is very friendly. So this could be a helpful champion in clan boss if you need a increased duration for a killable composition. Or maybe even if you need to increase the duration of, say, a block debuffs buff. The revive is also really nice for Knights Revenant faction because Knights Revenant faction is a fairly tough faction crypt. And up until this point, there was only 1 reviver. I think there's 1 reviver rare and then 1 reviver in the epic category. So the epic reviver is Rector Drath, and that is a single target revive. Right here, revives a single ally. It's a very strong, nice revive. But she's the only epic that has any revive at all, I think. And then, as far as rares are concerned, no, I think I'm thinking of Undead. I don't think there's a single reviver here. I don't think any of these champions are revivers. So, out of rares and epics, there was only 1 reviver. And you can see how many epics there were in this faction. Now, there are very good epics in this faction, but having a second option for a reviver could be extremely helpful in faction crypts. So if you don't have your reviver yet in the Knights Revenant faction, Malkith could certainly fulfill that role, and that would be nice. He is not nearly as good as Rector Drath. Rector Drath is top tier epic. I would say top 10 epic maybe in the game. Definitely if you're talking about non-voids, she's probably top 5. So one of my favorite non-void epics in the game. But he can fill that role, and he's a decent epic. He's definitely a decent epic. Okay, so strangely enough, out of the 7 champions that are available, it feels like we have 7 viable options. So you should examine your account, think about what role that you need to make progress in any particular area, and then see if one of the epics or the rares would fulfill that role. And if not, consider going for Bambus Fourleaf himself. Now, if you just can't go for the legendary, that's fine. Then there are a lot of good consolation prizes. I'm probably going to try to collect several on my newer account. So my new account is less than 40 days old. So I'm going to be looking for as many of these rares as I can get, and even maybe some of the epics. in order to get one copy of each epic and one copy of each rare, you'd actually have to succeed at 12 of the 16 or 17, I guess, events in the fusion. So that would be a tall order, but there's no reason to think that even an early game account couldn't pick up, 3 or 4 of these rares, maybe one of the epics and one of the rares in addition. Okay, so now I want to take a quick look at the fusion event calendar. Now, I'm not going to do a full out fusion plan here. One, because the fusion events already started, so you already have access to this calendar, and I'm not really previewing anything for you. And second off, because I think there's going to be so much variation out here for this. Bambus Fourleaf is not a must-get fusion, so I think a lot of players are just going to be going for some of these epics and rares. But just as a quick note about fusion event calendars, each tournament takes roughly 2,000 energy. You want to maybe budget around 2,200, 2,300 energy for a tournament. So that's the Dragon tournament. I'm sorry, I meant the Dungeon tournaments. The Dragon tournament, the Ice Golem tournament, the Spider tournament, and the Fire Knight tournament. So that's at least going to be 8,000 to 9,000 energy there. In addition to that, remember that you want to double dip with your Dungeon Divers events. These are turning out to be the hardest events right now. There are 3 Dungeon Divers events. They go throughout the entire duration of the fusion. Basically, they start on the second day and end on the second to last day. So you're looking at, 12 days there of Dungeon Divers. So if you can double dip with your tournaments, you want to do that. So here, Dragon tournament, you want to wait until Friday to start your Dragon tournament so you can double dip with the Dungeon Divers and then try to get as much of your Ice Golem done. Well, actually, Ice Golem will cover both Dungeon Divers 1 and 2, so you can basically spread that out however it feels best. Fire Knight tournament looks like you want to do the entirety of that during the Dungeon Diver event 2, and then the Spider tournament overlaps the Dungeon Divers event 3 in its entirety. But remember that a Dungeon Divers event takes about 5,000 energy. So even if you use all 2,000 Spider tournament energy during that Dungeon Divers event, you're going to still need to spend roughly 3,000 energy or more to complete that third Dungeon Divers event. Now, the Summon Rush is always a tricky event. You need typically 2,150 points to get the first champion during a Summon Rush. You can see that there are 2 available during the Summon Rush. Selenian Nightcloak is going to be the lower reward, and then Malekith Bloodflock is going to be the higher reward. Now, based on what we saw during the Newt fusion, Selenian Nightcloak would be at 2,150, and Malekith Bloodflock would be somewhere between 5,000 and 5,500. Now, with 500 points for a Sacred Shard, you're looking at 4 Sacred Shards for Selenia, plus 150 Mystery Shards, say, or a few other shards. For Malekith Bloodflock, you're talking about at least 10 Sacreds, or potentially hundreds or more of other shards. So the nice thing about getting the Malekith Bloodflock is that alleviates the need to go after 4 additional rares. So 1 of each rare can now be passed on if you get the Malekith Bloodflock. That may be worth the trade for some people, but if you are a free-to-play player, I highly recommend you don't go for the Malekith Bloodflock unless you've just got a ton of Sacred Shards lying around, because they're usually better to pull during a 2 times event. Now, that being said, if you are an endgame player and you're free to play, you may have those shards and you may not care about 2 times Sacred Shard events. And so you can just go after Malekith Bloodflock and make this fusion event a lot easier for yourself if you're particularly interested in using Bambus Fourleaf at endgame. As far as the artifact enhancement events are concerned, remember you're going to need 20 million per event, and there's no real double dipping with artifact enhancement events. You just have to have the silver. You can farm that silver during the tournaments from Dragon Tournament, so on and so forth. But remember that probably you want to start the fusion with at least 25 to 30 million silver in order to make this manageable. If you have at least, say, 15 million, you're probably in a good place to be able to stretch and do it. But if you only have 5 million in reserve, you are not going to be able to complete this without a whole lot of extra energy or gems spent. Finally, we have the Classic Arena Takedown, which should be a piece of cake. All Classic Arena takedowns, generally you can complete just doing your normal arena battles. It's a little bit trickier if you are stuck in silver, but if you are even in silver 4, you're probably okay on the Classic Arena takedowns. Just make sure you don't waste any tokens. Use all of your refreshes when they come around. So just be constantly refreshing. looking for easy defenses to beat. And by the way, it's a nice friendly thing for all of us in a fusion event to go ahead and put one-man defenses on our teams so that these classic arena takedowns get completed for everybody really easily. I think the community wins when we're all excited about completing the fusions. Why should we stand in the way of other players being able to get a new legendary? I did want to make mention of one thing that I noticed here, which is that on Sunday, October 1st, there are 8 potential events going on. It's actually 7 because the summon rush is twice. And then again, I think later on in the next Saturday and Sunday, you have 6 events going on simultaneously. You actually have 7 on October 7th. Now, just a quick reminder about the way this calendar works is you don't know what time of day these events start or end. So even though, let's say it says the summon rush ends on Monday, October 2nd, it could be at 2 a.m. October 2nd. It could be at 10 p.m. October 2nd. So always check the timers in the game, whether it's in the event page or in the tournament page, so that you don't accidentally miss out on completing one of these events and therefore, create a situation where you have to get a miraculous pull on one of the rares or something in order to complete the actual fusion. Don't put yourself in that bind. The final note I will say here is that this Champion Chase tournament that starts on Friday, October 6th, will coincide with a 2x Ancient Shard event. So even if you are not doing the entire fusion, if you have been saving up your Ancient Shards for that 2x event, you should be able to get several rewards there. And that can also be useful in getting food for the champion training event that is going on at the same time. Okay, so that is it. A little bit of a longer video, but we had a whole lot to cover. If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to hit the like button. Go ahead and subscribe to the channel as well. If you have any questions about the fusion, about whether or not you should go for it, or about which champion maybe you should take as a consolation prize and focus on, please put those in the comments below and I will try to get to them as quickly as I can. Thanks so much for hanging out. I've been Colred and I will see you in another video very soon.